Today, we're going to look at the life of the actress Mary Tyler Moore, who became famous as Laura Petrie on The Dick Van Dyke Show in the 1960s, and then even more famous with The Mary Tyler Moore Show in the 1970s. Mary Tyler Moore was a diabetic for most of her life. She had a miscarriage in 1969 at the age of 33, and while in the hospital, the doctors discovered she had a blood sugar of 750 milligrams per deciliter, which is unbelievably high. In fact, it was so high they wondered how she was still able to walk and function with that much sugar in her blood. Normal glucose is somewhere between 75 and 125. Being young, slim, and athletic, this did not seem to be a case of type 2 diabetes, and indeed it was not. They found she had type 1 diabetes, which meant that her pancreas was producing little to no insulin, a condition that she would live with for the rest of her years. She would need to inject insulin the rest of her life. At first, Mary kept quiet about her condition and managed it with some successes and some failures. But eventually, she went public with her diabetes and ended up becoming the chairman of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. She lived to the age of 80, and before she died, she wrote a book about her struggles with diabetes titled Growing Up Again, which will be the basis of much of what I'll be sharing with you in this video. At first, she rebelled against not only diabetes, but what the experts were telling her in terms of how to manage her diabetes. Her husband, knowing that sugar is not good for diabetics, removed from the house all sugary foods and sugary breakfast cereals and sugary snacks. So when Mary Tyler Moore got home from the hospital and saw how her house had been stripped of everything sweet, she went out immediately and bought a dozen glazed donuts, polishing off most of them before returning to the house. Not exactly a good start. Now, it's important to realize that when Mary was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic, it was 1969, long before the blood sugar monitors of today, when you can find your blood sugar level with a prick of your finger and about a 5-second wait. And nobody was doing A1C tests in those days. She was encouraged to test her blood sugar with strips that were held under a stream of urine, which would give you readings of +1 through +4. +1 being excellent glucose and +4 representing terribly high blood sugar. By the time she died in 2017, technology for testing glucose had skyrocketed, of course, but in those early days, there wasn't much. We have to give her kudos for the courage to write the book and for sharing her story. But in terms of providing specific ways and means to beat diabetes, or even manage it well, or hold it at bay, or whatever term you want to use, there's really not much that is helpful. In fact, at the beginning of the book, she writes, "There's no template to follow that will determine the course of the disease and how it affects a person's life. No one right way to manage diabetes. I'm sharing my story because it's what I have to give, shedding some light on the follies and achievements that I've racked up in my daily confrontation with the disease." But if there's really no basic set of guidelines that can help diabetics, well, we're all on our own. There's no point in reading any books, watching any videos, or listening to any nutritionists. We're just stuck with a few little trial and error experiments on our own bodies that maybe can give us a tiny bit of relief, but we should not expect any lifestyle or pattern of eating or advice from anybody that will exactly suit our own specific needs. Of course, I don't believe that for a second. When someone goes to a doctor for an infection, they nearly all treat that particular infection with a specific antibiotic. If someone breaks their leg, well, the doctor will set it using the same procedure he's done with dozens of other patients who broke their legs. If a patient requires the amputation of a leg, doctors will do the same thing. They will amputate that leg using the same procedure that doctors have been using for decades. If someone is in tremendous pain, doctors will prescribe the same pain relievers that they prescribe for hundreds of other patients. So the question is diabetes such a unique and specific affliction that there are no standards of care that will work on most diabetics? I don't think so. Type 2 diabetics may suffer from different and varying degrees of insulin resistance, but the same lifestyle intervention that works for a severe diabetic will work for a mild diabetic. It'll just take longer for the severe diabetic. Mary Tyler Moore shares at one point in the book the type of control she had over her glucose levels, and it wasn't real good. She writes this: "My lows are well documented, and my highs, well, I do tiptoe up to 400 on a really bad day. My A1Cs, not the recommended 7, I can tell you that, sometimes even more than 9. How sad that this beautiful lady and incredibly gifted actress could not find a way to achieve better control over her glucose levels. The results in her life were about what you would expect. She suffered from diabetic complications. For one TV production, she was forced to wear pointy-toe shoes that pinched her toes and were quite painful. As a result, she developed a blister on her small toe. Well, normally a blister on your toe is no big deal, but for a diabetic with poor glucose control, it can become a major problem. She was forced to go to the hospital and receive antibiotics through an IV. But after several days, the producer of a movie that she had recently made wanted to call the actors back in to film an extra scene. She tried to talk her doctor into letting her go free from that IV so she could go and do the scene, but he wouldn't hear of it. She was still in danger of losing that toe. Finally, they consented to have a nurse go with her and keep the IV working in between takes. When she did a scene at a table, they set up a type of stool under the table to keep her foot elevated. She did eventually heal, but it was not without a lot of hassles. Mary's diabetes came upon her after her stint on the Dick Van Dyke Show, but just before her portrayal as Mary Richards in the Mary Tyler Moore Show. At one point in the second show, she and other cast members gathered to meet and greet a new director. Mary had taken her insulin that morning, but she forgot to eat breakfast. At the meeting with the new director, Mary tried to say a few words, but her blood sugar was dropping fast. She was slurring her speech and not making any sense. Her fellow cast members and the director stared at her, curiously wondering what was going on. Instead of stopping, she babbled on, trying to explain her diabetes and her lack of eating was the problem. Finally, the show's producer seemed to get it, and he went over to her with a glass of orange juice. He pulled her head back and poured the orange juice down her throat. The high sugar concentration in the orange juice did the trick, and within 10 minutes she could feel herself returning to normal. Another time, she was walking down Madison Avenue in New York City when her blood sugar plummeted. Suddenly, she felt panicky, knowing that she was losing control. The noisy sounds of car horns and the construction workers added to her state of fear. She fumbled in her purse, desperately looking for a package of lifesavers. With shaky hands, she managed to open the package and put several in her mouth. Then she remembered a coffee shop nearby and hurried there. She writes, "I worried terribly about how it was going to look, my bursting in asking for a glass of orange juice. What's the matter with that woman? Is that Mary Tyler Moore? She's all rumpled and sweaty. She was never like that with Dick Van Dyke." I bellied up to the bar and ordered a large orange juice. 10 minutes later, all was well. Mary tells us in the book that the lowest her blood sugar has ever fallen was 24, which is dangerously low. Why is it that type 1 diabetics get such terrible and frequent hypos? The answer is that they eat too many carbohydrates and then they cannot precisely measure the exact amount of insulin they need in order to cover their meals. Sometimes they give themselves too much insulin and their glucose drops dangerously low. Other times they give themselves too little insulin and their blood sugar surges way too high. Dr. Richard Bernstein, a type 1 diabetic himself, saw this a long time ago, and he decided wisely, the only way I can keep my blood sugar under control is to eat meals with small amounts of carbohydrates, no more than 12 grams of carbs per meal, and then to measure the carbs exactly and to give himself the precise amount of insulin that would correspond to that meal. And his method has worked beautifully for him. He was diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic way back in 1946, and today at the age of 89, he's still alive and going strong. Mary's poorly controlled diabetes affected her sight. While in her 40s, her doctor told her that she had diabetic retinopathy and explained that abnormal glucose levels over the years were the cause. Her peripheral sight became worse and worse, causing her embarrassing moments as the once nimble dancer and singer now tripped over small things that normal people would see and avoid. Once, when she was walking on stage to be interviewed by Oprah Winfrey, she tripped over a step down. Happily, Oprah was standing close by and waiting to give her a hug and managed to catch her before she fell on her face. Mary writes, "I am practically blind in low light, and even when the world is well lit, I have no peripheral vision. Anyone to my side is invisible to me. And if someone proffers a hand at an introduction, I may miss it entirely, leaving the would-be acquaintance in a state of mild shock at my seemingly utter indifference." She went to a renowned eye specialist who examined her. When she asked him about retinopathy, he told her this: "In some ways, you know as much about this complication as anyone could. Everything that goes wrong with the diabetic eye was wrong with your eyes. You had glaucoma, proliferation, cataracts, edema, and bleeding in the retina." As she got older, her eyesight progressively worsened. When Mary was 77, former co-star Betty White said that her eyesight was her major problem and that she was almost at the point of not being able to see. By this point, Mary was going out less and less and mostly communicated with friends through phone calls. It was reported that she had heart and kidney problems as well as failing eyesight. Finally, she passed away at the age of 80 in 2017 due to heart failure, or more precisely, cardiopulmonary arrest. So why is it that diabetics, both type 1 and type 2, suffer from so many different complications? It would appear that there are certain conditions in our bodies that lead to a myriad of physical maladies that may include heart disease, kidney failure, blindness or near blindness, hypertension, strokes, and of course diabetes. The conditions that lead to these problems are 1. Consistently high glucose levels, 2. Consistently high insulin levels, 3. Significantly reduced blood circulation, and 4. Major and consistent blood sugar fluctuations. Some might argue that type 1 diabetics don't have to worry about high insulin levels since their bodies do not produce insulin. But if their blood sugar levels are extremely high, their doctors will often prescribe more and more insulin, and they end up injecting themselves with far more insulin than is normal or healthy. Some might argue that type 2 diabetics don't suffer from blood sugar fluctuations since their glucose is just always high. But that's not necessarily true. Sometimes when they take insulin or high-powered diabetic meds, their blood sugar can drop like a stone and they can have glucose bouncing up all and down all over the place, up and down, day after day, year after year. And some potential type 2 diabetics can experience reactive hypoglycemia with constantly fluctuating glucose levels when they eat a high-carb diet, which is exactly what I had many years ago. If we want to be free from those terrible diabetic complications, we must get control of our blood sugar levels and stay within an acceptable range. And if your A1C is 7 or higher, you can bet that your glucose levels are not in an optimal range, and your body is going to pay a price for this. There is a better way, and it is the way that Dr. Richard Bernstein discovered many years ago. Whether type 1 or type 2 diabetic, we must adopt a low-carbohydrate diet. The type 1s will match their lower-carb meals with lesser insulin as instructed by their doctors. Most type 2s will find that over time their pancreas can handle the easier load of less carbs. And as Dr. Jason Fung has advocated, type 2 diabetics could also do well to adopt a narrow window of eating for each day, perhaps allowing themselves to eat 2 or 3 meals within an 8-hour window of time, or just 2 meals within a 6-hour window, and absolutely no snacking between those meals. You can do it, my friend. You do not have to accept diabetes as a condition that will only get worse as you age. If you attack this monster with a low-carb lifestyle and time-restricted eating, you can have a better A1C in your 70s than you did in your 50s. You can see those complications recede and reverse themselves. You should be able to not only live to a ripe old age, but to do so without heart disease, with decent eyesight and healthy kidneys and a lean, mean liver. Sure, there's a price to pay, but it is so worth it. To learn more about the price of beating diabetes and some of the specifics about the lifestyle required, see my video, If I Had Sky-High Diabetes, What Would I Do? God bless you. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.